The morning sun cast long shadows across the small airfield as James loaded the last of the supply crates into his plane. The air held that perfect mixture of salt and humidity that always reminded him of home. At 42, James had the kind of weathered face that told stories without saying a word, laugh lines around his eyes from years of watching sunsets from his cockpit, and a permanent slight squint from staring into endless blue horizons. "That's the last of it," said May, the airfield manager, checking off items on her clipboard. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in her usual practical ponytail. "Weather's perfect today. You got lucky." James nodded, patting the side of his trusty cargo plane. The old bird wasn't much to look at with its faded blue stripe and the small dents that James considered beauty marks, but she had never let him down in 15 years of island deliveries. "The usual stops?" May asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yep. Toccoa, Vanu, Paliki, and Matala. Should be back before dark." James climbed into the cockpit, running through his pre-flight checklist with the ease of a man who could probably do it in his sleep. The familiar switches and dials welcomed him like old friends. The engine coughed once before settling into its steady rumble. James gave May a thumbs up through the window, then guided the plane down the short runway. The transition from ground to air always gave him a small thrill, that moment when gravity lost its grip and the world fell away beneath him. From up here, the clusters of South Pacific islands looked like emerald jewels scattered across a blue tablecloth. James knew them all by name, knew which ones had freshwater springs and which had the best fishing spots. 15 years of flying this route had turned the map in his mind from dots on paper to living, breathing places filled with faces he knew, and voices that greeted him by name. His first 3 stops went smoothly. On Toccoa, Old Man Tama insisted James stay for a cup of coffee while they loaded the medical supplies. On Vanu, the school kids waved from their classroom window as they always did. On Paliki, he delivered mail and picked up local crafts to sell. On the mainland, it was between Paliki and his final destination, Matala, that James often allowed himself to relax a bit. This stretch had no radio contact, just him and the endless blue. He'd sometimes hum old songs his grandfather taught him, or think about what he'd cook for dinner that night. Simple pleasures that made up a life he had chosen and never regretted. Today, he was thinking about fixing the leaky faucet in his kitchen when something caught his eye below. A flash of movement where there shouldn't be any. James blinked, wondering if it was just a trick of light on water. He was passing over the chain of uninhabited islets that locals called the Stepping Stones. 5 small islands too tiny and lacking in fresh water to ever have supported permanent settlements. But there it was again. Definite movement. On the 3rd islet in the chain. James tilted his head, puzzled. Maybe researchers. But nobody had filed flight plans or mentioned expeditions in this area during the morning briefing. Could be shipwrecked fishermen, he thought, though the waters here were rarely fished due to dangerous currents. Curiosity got the better of him. James banked the plane gently, circling back toward the islet. His radio crackled with static as he tried to call in his change of course, but he was still in the dead zone. He'd report it once he got closer to Matala. "Let's take a look," he murmured to himself, dropping altitude gradually. The islet grew larger in his view. A classic teardrop shape with a small rocky hill at one end and a crescent beach at the other. Most of it was covered in dense vegetation, the kind that grew quickly in the tropical climate. Nothing unusual so far. As he circled lower, flying at about 500 feet now, he could see the beach more clearly. That's when he noticed the structures, crude shelters made from what looked like driftwood, palm fronds, and... was that torn fabric? Definitely not a research expedition's equipment. James felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He brought the plane down to 300 feet, the lowest he dared go without proper landing preparations. Now he could make out people moving on the beach. Some were looking up at his plane, others seemed to be lying down. A few were waving frantically. The pieces clicked together in his mind. The torn fabric that might have been from life vests or clothing, the makeshift shelters, the desperate waving. These people were stranded. James grabbed his binoculars from the side compartment, keeping one hand steady on the controls. Through the powerful lenses, the scene came into sharp focus, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The people on the beach were in bad shape. Even from this height, he could see they were thin, too thin, with ragged clothing and sunburnt skin. Some appeared injured, lying under crude shelters while others tended to them. They had arranged stones on the beach to spell out, "Help," a message meant for passing ships that would never see it from the dangerous water surrounding the islet. But it was when he focused on a group near the tree line that James felt his chest tighten. They were huddled around something, a logo painted on what looked like a piece of broken hull. Even partially covered by sand and damaged, James recognized it instantly. A blue star with a wave design. The Pacific Star. The luxury cruise ship that had disappeared without a trace 3 weeks ago. The mystery that had dominated news cycles and sparked the largest search operation in the region's history was solved right before his eyes. The ship that had been carrying over 200 passengers and crew had somehow ended up wrecked near these remote islets, far from its planned route, and only a handful of people appeared to have made it to shore. James's hands trembled as he lowered the binoculars. A scream built in his throat, not from fear but from the sheer horror of what he was witnessing. These people had been stranded here for weeks while search parties combed areas hundreds of miles away, based on the ship's last reported position. The scream finally escaped his lips, echoing in the small cockpit. Oh God, no. He'd flown near these islands just 2 weeks ago, delivering supplies to Matala. Had they been here then? Had he passed right over them without noticing? The thought made him sick to his stomach. James forced himself to take deep breaths. These people needed him to keep it together. They needed him to be their link to rescue. He checked his fuel gauge, enough to finish his route to Matala and return to the main island, but not enough to attempt a risky landing on an unknown beach. Besides, his cargo plane wasn't built for landing on anything but a proper airstrip. Keyed his radio again, knowing he was still out of range but trying anyway. Nothing but static answered him. The survivors below were growing more frantic in their waving. Some were jumping up and down now, probably afraid he would leave without seeing them. James needed to let them know he'd spotted them. That help would come. He dipped the plane's wings deliberately. Left, right, left, the universal pilot's signal of acknowledgement. Then he circled the island twice more, making sure they understood he'd seen them. James checked his emergency kit. It contained water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a waterproof pouch with flares and a notepad. Not nearly enough for all those people, but something to give them hope while he arranged rescue. Quickly, he scribbled a note. Saw you. Getting help. Return tomorrow. He wrapped it around a water bottle with a bright orange survival blanket to make it more visible, securing it with rubber bands from his supply log. James opened the small drop hatch used for delivering supplies to areas without proper landing facilities. It would be tricky, but he had to try. Circling back, he lined up with the beach, descended as low as he safely could, and released the package. It landed on the sand, and he watched as several figures ran to retrieve it. He circled, once more low enough to see someone holding up his note, their faces turned toward his plane. With a heavy heart, James knew he had to leave now to get help. He dipped his wings one final time, then reluctantly turned toward Matala, pushing the throttle forward. His hands still shook on the controls, and tears blurred his vision as the islet grew smaller behind him. As soon as he came within radio range of Matala, he'd call in the Discovery and coordinate the biggest rescue operation these islands had ever seen. Those people down there had survived against impossible odds for weeks. James would make damn sure they made it home. But as he flew away, the images stayed burned in his mind. The desperate faces, the makeshift camp, the broken piece of hull, and the question that would haunt him for a long time to come. How many had been lost before they reached that shore? How many never made it off the ship at all? James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and focused on the horizon. There would be time for those questions later. Right now, those survivors needed him to be the link that brought them back to the world, and he wouldn't let them down. James's hands were still shaking as he radioed the control tower at Matala. The island's small airstrip came into view, a gray slash against the lush green landscape. His voice cracked as he spoke into his headset. Matala Tower, this is Supply Flight 47. I have an emergency to report. Over. The calm voice of the tower operator responded immediately. Supply 47, this is Matala. Go ahead with your emergency, over. I've found survivors on Islet 3 of the Stepping Stones chain. I believe they're from the Pacific Star. There are approximately 40 people. Many appear injured. They need immediate evacuation. Over. A long pause followed. James could almost picture the shock on the operator's face. Supply 47. Did you say Pacific Star survivors? Please confirm, over. Confirmed, Matala. I saw a piece of hull with the logo. They've built shelters on the beach. They need medical attention urgently. Over. Another pause, then. Understood. Supply 47. Continue to Matala for landing. We're contacting Coast Guard and emergency services now. Over. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur. James landed on autopilot, his mind still back on that beach with those desperate faces looking up at him. As the wheels touched down on Matala's airstrip, a small crowd had already gathered. News traveled fast on the islands. James barely had. The engines shut down before Lonnie, the island's doctor, was at his door. Her normally cheerful face was tight with concern. Is it true? She asked as James climbed down. The Pacific Star? He nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted. I saw the hull piece myself. They've spelled help with rocks on the beach. Lonnie put a hand on his arm. How many? Maybe 40. Hard to count from the air. Some weren't moving. He swallowed hard. They look bad, Lonnie, really bad. The island's mayor, a stocky man named Teo, pushed through the gathering crowd. Coast Guard's been notified. They're dispatching ships from the main island, but it'll take 4 hours at best. They may not have 4 hours, James said, the horror of what he'd seen settling deeper into his bones. Some looked close to. He couldn't finish the sentence. The Pacific Star had gone missing 23 days ago. 23 days on a tiny islet with no fresh water source. It was a miracle anyone was still alive. Teo scratched his gray beard. What about your plane? Can you take Lonnie and some supplies back there? James shook his head. No place to land. Beach is too narrow and rocky on the edges. Best I could do was drop a package. The fishing boats? Someone suggested from the crowd. Too dangerous, an older fisherman replied. The currents around those islets would smash us against the rocks, that's why we never go there. As the crowd debated, James felt a strange calm settling over him. He knew what he had to do. I'll go back, he said, his voice cutting through the arguments. I'll drop more supplies, water, food, medicine, everything we can spare. It won't be enough, but it might keep them going until the Coast Guard arrives. Lonnie frowned. You just landed. You need to rest. No time, James replied, already turning back to his plane. Let's get everything loaded. I need water, medical supplies, easy-to-eat food, blankets, anything that might help. The people of Matala moved with purpose. In less than an hour, they had gathered supplies from the clinic, the school, and their own homes. James's plane was quickly refueled. Laney prepared medical kits with instructions written in 3 languages. Drop this first, she told James, handing him a bright red waterproof bag. It has rehydration salts and basic medications. If they haven't had clean water for weeks, they'll need this more than anything. James nodded, his earlier panic replaced by determined focus. He climbed back into his cockpit, the islanders having helped him rearrange the cargo area to accommodate the emergency supplies. Coast Guard says they've deployed 2 ships and a helicopter. Teo called up to him. They're also contacting every vessel in the area. Just keep those people alive a few more hours. James gave a thumbs up as he started. The engines. The weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders, but in a strange way it steadied him. Those people had survived against impossible odds for weeks. He wouldn't let them down now. Taking off again, he pushed the plane as fast as it would safely go. The sea below was darkening as afternoon faded toward evening. James felt the minutes, ticking by like physical things. When Islet 3 came back into view, James could see the survivors had gathered on the beach, clearly watching for his return. They must have been terrified that he wouldn't come back, that they had been spotted only to be abandoned again. He circled once, dropping lower than before. Now he could see individual faces looking up. A tall man with a makeshift crutch, a woman cradling what appeared to be a child, an older person being supported by two others. James had prepared the supply drops carefully, packing items in waterproof bags weighted so they would fall straight and not be carried off by the wind. Each was attached to a small, bright parachute, made from the emergency supplies on his plane. One by one, he dropped the packages as he flew low passes over the beach. The red medical kit first, as Lonnie had instructed. Then water, food, blankets. Each time he passed, he could see people rushing to retrieve the supplies, their movements gaining energy as hope returned. On his final pass, he dropped a package containing a battery-powered radio and a note with the emergency frequency. It wouldn't help them now. They were still in the radio dead zone. But if they made it through the night, it might allow them to communicate with rescuers in the morning. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, James knew he had to leave. His fuel was limited, and flying back to the main island in the dark would be challenging enough. He couldn't risk becoming another casualty. For his final pass, he flew as low as he dared. The survivors had arranged themselves on the beach, standing in formation. As James passed overhead, they raised their arms in unison, a salute to the pilot who had found them when all hope seemed lost. The lump in James's throat made it hard to breathe. He dipped his wings in response, his vision blurring with tears. Then, with the heaviest of hearts, he turned his plane toward home. The flight back was silent, except for the steady hum of the engines. James radioed in his position, confirming that he had successfully dropped supplies. The Coast Guard vessels were still hours away. The helicopter closer, but without landing capability on the islet. It could only provide additional supplies and assessment. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, James thought about the people he'd left behind. Who were they? What had they endured? How had they survived when so many others apparently hadn't? The Pacific Star had been carrying 237 passengers and crew. James had seen maybe 40 people on that beach. The math was devastating. Landing at the main island airport after dark, James was met by a flurry of activity. News vans with satellite dishes, officials in uniforms, reporters shouting questions. He brushed past them all, heading straight for the emergency operations center that had been hastily established in the airport's small conference room. Inside, maps were spread on tables. Radio operators coordinated with vessels. A Coast Guard commander looked up as James entered. "Our pilot has landed," someone announced, and suddenly all eyes were on him. "Tell us exactly what you saw," the commander said, pulling out a chair for James. For the next hour, James described everything in painstaking detail. The location of the survivors on the beach, their apparent conditions, the makeshift shelters, the piece of hull he'd spotted. They showed him photographs of the Pacific Star, and he confirmed the logo matched what he'd seen. As the rescue operation took shape around him, James felt the adrenaline that had kept him going finally begin to ebb. Exhaustion crashed over him, in waves. A kind-faced woman from the Red Cross brought him a cup of coffee and a sandwich. "You've done something extraordinary today," she said quietly. "Those people have been given a second chance because of you." James shook his head. "I just happened to look down at the right moment. They're the extraordinary ones. 3 weeks on that islet." He couldn't finish the thought. Outside the conference room, the world was exploding with the news. The mystery of the Pacific Star, which had dominated headlines for weeks, was partially solved. Families who had given up hope were cautiously rekindling it. And somewhere out on the dark ocean, rescue ships were racing toward 40 survivors who had endured what most would consider unsurvivable. James stared into his coffee cup, his mind filled with images of gaunt faces looking up at his plane, arms raised in desperate hope. He knew that whatever happened next, his life had changed course as surely as his plane had when he'd first spotted movement on that remote isle. The waiting had begun. Dawn broke over the operations center with painful slowness. James had dozed off in a plastic chair, his neck stiff and his dreams haunted by faces looking up at him from the beach. Someone shook his shoulder gently, and he jerked awake to find Lonnie holding out a fresh cup of coffee. "They're bringing them in," she said, her eyes bright with a mixture of hope and professional concern. "First rescue vessel reached the islet about an hour ago. Helicopter did a night drop of medical supplies and has been doing assessments since first light." James stood up so quickly he nearly spilled the coffee. "How are they?" Lonnie's expression tightened. "Alive. That's the important part. But it's bad, James. Really bad. They're setting up a field hospital at the harbor. I'm heading there now to help." James followed her outside, where the sky was turning from purple to pale blue. The small airport was buzzing with activity, medical personnel arriving from neighboring islands, supply planes being loaded and unloaded, news crews setting up satellite feeds. "I want to go to the harbor," James said. He needed to see them, these people whose existence had consumed his thoughts for the past 15 hours. Lonnie nodded, understanding without him having to explain. "Come with me. They might need help with translations. The survivors, they're from all over." The drive to the harbor took only 20 minutes, but to James, it felt endless. As they crested the final hill, he could see the Coast Guard vessels approaching the docks. Medical teams in bright vests were assembled, ready with stretchers and equipment. Ambulances stood by, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. 47 survivors confirmed, said a voice over the emergency radio in Lonnie's truck. 12 critical, 25 serious but stable, 10 walking wounded. Prepare for immediate triage. 47. The number hit James like a physical blow. Somehow, on that tiny speck of land with no fresh water source, 47 people had managed to survive for over 3 weeks. They parked and rushed down to the docks. Lonnie was immediately waved through the security perimeter, her medical credentials, getting her access to the front lines. After a moment's hesitation, an officer nodded at James, too. "You're the pilot," the man said. It wasn't a question. "They've been asking for you." The first boat was docking now. James stood back, giving the medical teams room to work, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. One by one, the survivors were helped off the vessel, some on stretchers, some supported by Coast Guard personnel, a few walking shakily on their own. Their condition shocked him even though he'd tried to prepare himself. Skin stretched tight over bones. Sunburn so severe they'd blistered and peeled multiple times. Makeshift bandages on injuries that had clearly gone untreated for weeks. But what struck him most were their eyes. Even in the worst cases, even in those being rushed immediately to waiting ambulances, there was a fierce light of survival that burned brighter than their physical suffering. A woman was helped down the gangplank, her arm in a crude sling made from what looked like part of a life vest. Despite her obvious pain, she kept turning back, checking on an older man being carried on a stretcher behind her. "That's Dr. Helen," said a Coast Guard officer standing next to James. "Ship's doctor. Kept at least 6 people alive who would have died otherwise. Set broken bones, treated infections, rationed what little medication they salvaged. All with basically nothing to work with." James watched as Dr. Helen insisted on staying with her patients even as medical staff tried to get her to sit down and receive treatment herself. The determination on her gaunt face spoke volumes about the past 3 weeks. The second rescue boat was docking now. More survivors, more stories etched into exhausted faces. A tall man with a makeshift crutch, the same one James had noticed from his plane, was helping others disembark despite his own injury. "That's the ship's first officer," the Coast Guard officer explained. "Chen. When the captain was killed, in the initial disaster he took charge. Organized everything, the rafts, the salvage operations, the camp. These people owe their lives to him as much as to anyone." James felt a wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. These weren't just nameless survivors anymore. They were people with stories, with courage, with unimaginable strength. A commotion near the third boat drew his attention. A young woman was being carried off on a stretcher, an IV already running into her arm. Next to her, walking with support, From two Coast Guard members was a thin man who refused to leave her side despite his own obvious weakness. Husband and wife, the officer said quietly. Honeymooners. She's been unconscious for 2 days. Severe dehydration. He gave her his water rations. The man looked up as they passed, his eyes meeting James's for just a moment. Recognition flickered. There, he had seen the plane, had understood what it meant. He nodded once, a gesture so full of gratitude that James had to look away, his throat tight. More boats arrived. More stories. A grandmother who had kept children's spirits up with stories. A college student who had figured out how to catch rainwater more efficiently. A retired Navy man who had helped build the shelters. Among the last to arrive was a frail, older woman supported by a teenage boy who looked to be her grandson. Despite her condition, she was smiling, patting the boy's hand reassuringly. She was the one who spotted your plane first, the Coast Guard officer told James. Kept insisting a plane would come, even when others had given up hope. When they heard your engine, she was the one who organized them to make signals. James watched as the woman and boy were gently helped into an ambulance. Hope. That was what had kept them alive when logic said they should have perished. Hope, and a stubborn refusal to give up. As the last of the survivors were brought ashore, James found himself drawn to the field hospital that had been set up in a nearby warehouse. Inside was controlled chaos. Medical teams working on the most critical cases, others documenting injuries and conditions, support staff setting up more beds as helicopters continued to bring in supplies and personnel from other islands. Lonnie spotted him and waved him over. She was helping treat a middle-aged man with a badly infected leg wound. "This is him," she told the patient. "The pilot who spotted you." The man reached out a trembling hand, which James took carefully. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy from dehydration. We had almost given up. "What happened?" James asked, the question that had been burning in everyone's minds since the Pacific Star disappeared. "How did you end up so far from your course?" The man closed his eyes briefly, the memory clearly painful. "Storm, worse than anything the captain had ever seen. Hit us at night. Power went out. Then something struck the hull. Maybe a shipping container, maybe debris. We were taking on water so fast." He shook his head. "Evacuation was chaos, darkness, screaming. Half the lifeboats couldn't launch. We got separated from the others." His voice faltered, and Lonnie gave James a warning look not to push too hard. But the man continued, seemingly needing to tell the story. "Current took us, days drifting. No radio, minimal supplies. When we spotted the islet, it seemed like a miracle. We made it ashore with what we could salvage. Thought we'd be rescued in days." A bitter smile crossed his cracked lips. Then days became weeks. James wanted to ask more about the others, about how many lifeboats had launched, about whether there might be more survivors out there, but the man's energy was clearly fading. Lonnie gently shooed James away, turning her attention back to treating her patient. Outside the medical area, James found himself face to face with First Officer Chen, the man with the crutch. He looked even more exhausted up close, but was still checking on others, still leading even now. "You're the pilot," Chen said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "Your plane. When we saw it, I can't describe what that felt like. Like seeing hope with wings." James felt humbled by the man's words. "I just happened to look down at the right moment." Chen shook his head. "No such thing as just happened. After what we've been through. Call it fate, call it luck, call it whatever you want. But you saved us." He looked back at the medical area, where his fellow survivors were receiving treatment. "All of us." Before James could respond, a Coast Guard commander approached them. "We're organizing a search of the surrounding islands based on current patterns. If there are other lifeboats out there." The unspoken question hung in the air. Chen's face darkened with pain that went beyond physical. 3 boats made it off the ship that I saw," he said quietly. "Ours had 29 originally. We lost people to injuries, exposure, The landing itself. He paused, steadying himself. The other two boats had similar numbers. If they found land, the commander nodded, making notes. We've got aircraft and vessels combing every island within 200 miles. If there's anyone else out there, we'll find them. As the commander walked away, Chen turned back to James. I need to tell you something. That package you dropped yesterday with the note, it saved lives. We had people ready to give up. That note, knowing help was coming, it gave them the strength to hold on through one more night. James felt tears threatening again. He blinked them back, focusing on the present, on what still needed to be done. I should get back to my plane, help with the search. Chen nodded, understanding. Go, find the others. Bring them home too. As James turned to leave, Chen called after him. When you fly over our islet again, dip your wings, so they know it's you. James nodded, a promise without words. As he headed back toward the airport, the weight of what had happened, and what might still be happening on other islands, settled on his shoulders. But along with it came a fierce determination. Somewhere out there, others might be waiting, watching the sky for wings that would bring them home. And James wouldn't stop looking until every last survivor was found or every last island searched. The rescue had only just begun. The search lasted 5 days. 5 days of flying until James's eyes burned from scanning endless blue water and green specks of land. 5 days of hope rising and falling with each radio report. 5 days of pushing his old plane to its limits, refueling only when absolutely necessary. He wasn't alone in the sky. The Coast Guard had deployed every available aircraft. Commercial airlines had adjusted their routes to fly over areas of interest. Even private pilots had volunteered, forming a ragtag aerial search party that covered thousands of square miles of ocean. On the third day, they found another lifeboat, empty, damaged, drifting about 40 miles from the first islet. The discovery sent ripples of both hope and dread through the rescue teams. Hope that it confirmed other boats had indeed launched successfully. Dread at what might have happened to the people inside. James was refueling when the radio crackled with the news he'd been both expecting and fearing. All search units, this is Coast Guard Command. We have confirmed survivors on Islet 5 of the Northern Chain. Repeat, confirmed survivors on Northern Chain 5. His hands shook as he rushed through his pre-flight checks. Northern Chain 5 was barely more than a rocky outcropping with a small beach, even less hospitable than the first islet. How anyone could have survived there for 3 weeks seemed impossible. By the time James reached the area, a Coast Guard vessel was already approaching the tiny island. Through his binoculars, he could see figures on the beach, fewer than, at the first sight, moving with even less energy. His heart sank as he counted. Only 11 people. The second lifeboat had reportedly held 27 passengers and crew. James circled above as the rescue team reached the shore. Even from his height, he could see the grim expressions of the Coast Guard personnel as they assessed the survivors. One by one, they were carefully moved to the boat, some on stretchers, others helped by supporting arms. That night, back at the main island, James sat in the makeshift command center as reports came in. The 11 survivors from Northern Chain, 5 were in worse condition than the first group. They'd had even less shelter, almost no salvage supplies, and no medical personnel among them. 4 were in critical condition, fighting for their lives in the island's small hospital. The story they told was harrowing. Their lifeboat had been damaged during launch, taking on water from the beginning. They'd lost 8 people before even reaching the islet, swept away by waves, succumbing to injuries or simply losing their grip on the overcrowded boat during storm swells. Once on the rocky isle, they'd faced challenges even more severe than the first group. No materials to build proper shelters, almost no vegetation for shade, minimal rainfall to collect. 8 more had died on the island, from injuries, dehydration, and in one case, a desperate attempt to swim to what they thought was a larger island nearby. Do you think there could be more out there? James asked the Coast Guard commander. A weathered woman named Koa, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since the rescue began. She rubbed her eyes, studying the maps spread across the table. Current patterns, satellite imagery, probability models. They told a story that no one wanted to hear. If there is a third group, they would have drifted north and east, she said carefully. That's open ocean for hundreds of miles, unless they found one of these tiny atolls. She didn't need to finish the thought. James nodded, the weight of those unspoken words settling on his shoulders. 237 people had been on the Pacific Star. They'd found 58 survivors. The math was brutal. We don't stop looking, Koa said firmly, as if reading his thoughts. Not until we've checked every possible location. The fourth day brought rain so heavy that visibility dropped to near zero. Most aircraft were grounded, but the ships continued their methodical search, braving rough seas and fading odds. James used the forced downtime to visit the hospital. The survivors from both islets were now in the same facility, the most critical cases having been stabilized enough that medical teams could care for everyone in one location. Security was tight. News organizations from around the world had descended on the small island, desperate for interviews and footage. Inside, James found a scene both heartbreaking and hopeful. The survivors were beginning to look more like people, and less like the walking ghosts they'd been when first rescued. IV fluids had brought back some color to their faces. Clean bandages had replaced makeshift ones. For some, the simple luxuries of a real bed, clean water, and regular meals seemed almost overwhelming after what they'd endured. In one corner of the ward, James spotted First Officer Chen, his leg now properly set and casted. He was sitting up in bed, engaged in intense conversation with Coast Guard officials and what appeared to be investigators from the Maritime Safety Board. Nearby, Dr. Helen was actually sleeping, looking years younger without the weight of keeping, her fellow survivors alive resting solely on her shoulders. A nurse guided James through the ward. Some patients were too weak or sedated to recognize him, but others lit up with recognition. The honeymooner, whose wife had been unconscious, gave James a thumbs up from beside his wife's bed. She was awake now, sipping broth through a straw. The older woman who had first spotted his plane reached out as he passed, catching his hand in a surprisingly strong grip. "I told them you'd come back," she said, her voice thin but determined. "Every day I told them to watch the sky." James swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry it took so long to find you." She shook her head. "You found us. That's what matters." The far end of the ward, a small area, had been curtained off. James could hear quiet sobbing from within. The nurse's expression turned solemn. "We lost 2 last night," she whispered. "Both from the second group. Their bodies just couldn't recover from the prolonged dehydration and exposure. We did everything we could. 56 survivors now." The number kept changing in the wrong direction. On the 5th day, the rain cleared, and the search resumed with renewed urgency. Everyone knew they were reaching the outer limits of survival possibility. If there were more survivors out there, time was running out. James took off at dawn, his assigned search area covering a cluster of tiny atolls that satellite imagery showed just might, be large enough for people to have found refuge. The odds were astronomically low, but in a situation like this, even the slimmest chance had to be pursued. Hour after hour, he flew methodical patterns, his eyes scanning each patch of land and sea. Nothing, just empty beaches and unbroken waves. The radio occasionally crackled with reports from other search teams, all negative. By mid-afternoon, fatigue was setting in. James had been pushing himself beyond reasonable limits for days. His vision blurred occasionally, forcing him to blink hard and refocus. He knew he should head back soon, that flying while exhausted was dangerous, but each time he thought of turning around, he imagined someone looking up, waiting for a plane that never appeared. Just one more atoll, he told himself. One more pass. The tiny island came into view, barely more than a sandbar with a few scraggly trees. James reduced altitude, circling once, seeing nothing but empty beach. He was about to turn away when something caught his eye, a flash of color against the white sand that didn't match the natural environment. His heart rate spiked as he circled back, dropping lower. The color resolved into fabric, what looked like a shirt or piece of clothing tied to a makeshift pole. A flag. James grabbed his binoculars, hands shaking with adrenaline and hope. The beach appeared empty, but the flag was definitely man-made. He scanned the tree line, the rocks, looking for any sign of movement. There, a dark opening among the rocks on one side of the island. A small cave, or overhang, and just visible in the shadows, the outline of what might be a person. James keyed his radio immediately. Search command, this is Supply 47. Possible survivor sighting at coordinates. He rattled off the numbers from his GPS. I repeat, possible survivor, single individual, showing signs of shelter creation. The response was immediate. Supply 47, this is search command. Coast Guard vessel Manta is approximately 30 minutes from your position. Can you confirm life signs? James circled again, even lower this time, hoping to provoke a reaction from whoever might be in that cave. No movement yet. I'm going to try to signal them. He dipped his wings dramatically, then flew directly over the island, making a show of spotting them. On his next pass, he saw movement. A figure emerging slowly from the cave, shading their eyes to look up. One person. Just one. They were waving weakly, clearly having seen the plane. Search command. Confirmed survivor, alive. Mobile, but appearing weak. One individual only. As James continued to circle, keeping the lone survivor in sight, mixed emotions washed over him. Joy at finding someone alive against all odds. Heartbreak that it was just one person. Questions about what had happened to the others who might have been with them. The lone figure on the beach had managed to drag what looked like palm fronds into the shape of an arrow, pointing toward the side of the island with slightly calmer waters, suggesting a landing spot for the approaching rescue boat. That's good thinking, James murmured to himself. Hang in there, just a little longer. He stayed overhead until he spotted the Coast Guard vessel approaching, not wanting the survivor to think they'd been abandoned again. Only when he saw the rescue team launching their smaller craft toward the beach did he finally turn his plane toward home, his fuel gauge hovering near empty. As he flew away, the reality of what they'd found hit him fully. 57 survivors out of 237 souls aboard the Pacific Star. Less than a quarter of those who had set sail on what was supposed to be a dream vacation. The world would soon be asking questions. How had the ship strayed? So far off course? Why hadn't the emergency systems worked? Could more people have been saved if the search had focused on the right area sooner? But those questions would have to wait. For now, 57 people who should by all rights be dead were alive because of luck, determination, and the human will to survive against impossible odds. And one pilot who happened to look down at just the right moment. 6 months passed like a dream, and a nightmare rolled into one. The world's attention had moved on to other disasters, other headlines. But for those connected to the Pacific Star, time had taken on a different quality, moving both too quickly and too slowly, marked by healing, by grief, by questions that might never find answers. James sat on his small porch watching the sun rise over the harbor. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten as he lost himself in thought. Today was the day. The memorial service. The return to the islet where it all began. In the months since the rescue, the survivors' stories had become clearer. The official investigation had pieced together what happened that terrible night when the Pacific Star encountered a storm so severe it wasn't properly forecasted. The ship had lost power, drifted off course, and struck an uncharted reef. The damage was catastrophic. In the darkness and chaos, only 3 lifeboats had successfully launched before the ship went down. 59 survivors in total had been rescued. The final 2 found clinging to debris nearly 100 miles from the wreck site, picked up by a passing cargo ship that had joined the search. 59 out of 237. The math still haunted James on sleepless nights. The investigation had found no negligence by the crew, just a series of catastrophic circumstances that had turned a luxury cruise into one of the worst maritime disasters in recent memory. The captain, who went down with his ship, was posthumously commended for his efforts to save as many as possible in impossible circumstances. James's phone buzzed. pulling him from his thoughts. A text from Lonnie. "We're boarding in 30 minutes. Don't be late." He hadn't planned to be part of today's ceremony. He'd done his job, found the survivors, helped with the search. That should have been the end of it. But then the letters started coming. From survivors, from families, from people he'd never met but whose lives had been forever changed by his routine flight that day. And then the call from First Officer Chen, now recovered enough to walk, with just a cane. "We're building a memorial on the islet. We need you there. You're part of this story too." James had resisted at first. He wasn't good with emotions, with ceremonies, with being the center of attention. But Chen had been persistent. "This isn't just for the ones we lost," he'd said. "It's for those of us who survived, for closure, for healing." So here he was, dressed in his best clothes, about to board a boat to return to the place that had changed everything. The harbor was busy when he arrived. A large passenger vessel had been chartered to take family members, survivors, and officials to the islet. Smaller boats would follow with press and others connected to the event. Security was tight. This was a private ceremony first and foremost, though portions would later be shared with the world. James spotted familiar faces as he approached. Dr. Helen, looking healthy again, her expertise now focused on studying survival, medicine. The honeymoon couple holding hands as they had through their entire recovery. The grandmother who had kept watch for planes, now accompanied by her grandson who hadn't left her side since the rescue. And there was Chen, leaning on his cane but standing tall, coordinating last-minute details with the quiet authority that had kept so many alive on that beach. "You came," Chen said simply when he spotted James. No questions, no surprise, just acknowledgement. James nodded. "Didn't have much choice after all those letters you had everyone send me?" Chen smiled, the first genuine smile James had seen from him. "I may have suggested it to a few people. A few? I've gotten over 40. There would have been more, but some are still working on their handwriting after everything." The joke, small and dark as it was, broke the tension. Both men laughed, then grew serious again as they boarded the vessel. The journey to the islet took just under 2 hours. James spent most of it near the bow, watching the horizon, avoiding the emotional conversations happening all around him. Some families were visiting the place where their loved ones had spent their final days. Some survivors were returning to the site of their greatest trauma. The atmosphere was heavy with grief and something else, something like reverence. When the islet came into view, James felt a jolt of recognition mixed with disbelief. It looked so small from here, so insignificant against the vast ocean. How had anyone survived on that tiny patch of land for 3 weeks? As they drew closer, he could see the changes. A proper dock had been constructed on one side, allowing for safe landing. The memorial itself was visible on the highest point, a simple stone structure that somehow looked like it belonged there, like it had grown from the island itself. "It's designed to be seen from the air," said a voice beside him. James turned to find the lone survivor from the third islet standing there. The man had been identified as a ship's engineer, the only one of his lifeboat group to make it to land. "So pilots flying over will always remember to look down." James swallowed hard. "Smart thinking." "We thought so." The man paused. "I never properly thanked you. By the time I was coherent enough, you were back flying search patterns." "No thanks. Needed, I was just doing my job." The engineer shook his head. "No, finding us wasn't your job. You could have flown right past. Many would have. But you looked down and you saw and you came back. That wasn't just doing your job." Before James could respond, the boat's engines slowed as they approached the new dock. The time for private conversations was over. The ceremony was about to begin. As they disembarked, James was struck by how different everything looked. The beach where desperate survivors had once huddled was now clean and peaceful. The makeshift shelters were gone, replaced by temporary structures for the day's events. Only the trees remained the same, silent witnesses to both tragedy and survival. The families and survivors gathered around the memorial, a stone column rising from a circular base with the names of all 237 people who had been aboard the Pacific Star engraved in a spiral pattern. Those who had survived had a small star beside their names. Those who had not were remembered with the same care, the same permanence. The ceremony was simple, but powerful. Religious leaders from various faiths offered prayers and blessings. Officials spoke briefly about the lessons learned from the tragedy. Family members laid flowers at the base of the monument. Then Chen stepped forward, supported by Dr. Helen on one side and the grandmother who had spotted the plane on the other. "We gather here today, not just to mourn, but to remember," he began. "To remember those who were lost, to acknowledge what was endured, to recognize what was overcome." His voice, once weak from dehydration, now carried across the gathered crowd with surprising strength. "This place is sacred to us now, not because we would have chosen to be here, but because it is where we learned the true meaning of human resilience, where we discovered strengths we didn't know we had, where we lost friends and found family." James stood at the back of the crowd listening, remembering the gaunt faces that had looked up at his plane that day. The desperate waving, the shelters made from nothing, the will to live that had kept them going day after day when logic said they should have perished. "And we especially want to thank the people who found us when we thought we were forgotten," Chen continued. The pilot who spotted movement on this remote isle looked closer and was moved to action. "James Mercer, would you please come forward?" James froze. This wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't supposed to speak. He wasn't prepared. But the crowd had turned, looking at him expectantly, and Chen was waiting with an outstretched hand. Somehow, his feet carried him forward. The survivors. He reached out, touching his arm, his shoulder, murmuring thanks. The family members nodded in solemn gratitude. By the time he reached Chen, James's eyes were burning with unshed tears. "I don't have a speech prepared," he said quietly. "You don't need one," Chen replied. "Just speak from here." He tapped his chest over his heart. James turned to face the crowd, seeing not strangers, but people whose stories he knew, whose strength he had witnessed. He took a deep breath. "6 months ago, I was just doing my job," he began. "Flying a route I'd flown hundreds of times before. I looked down and saw something unexpected. That's all it was, a moment of curiosity. I had no idea that moment would connect all of us forever." The wind rustled through the trees as he spoke, carrying his words across the small island. "What I saw here changed me. Not just the suffering, though that was terrible to witness, but the strength, the determination, the refusal to give up when everything said you should. I've been a pilot for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the world had to offer from above. I was wrong. I had never seen human courage like I saw on this beach." James gestured to the memorial behind him. "This monument honors those who were lost, as it should, but it also stands as a testament to something else, to the spark in us that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest moments, to the connections that form when we need each other most." He looked at the survivors, meeting their eyes one by one. "You didn't need me to be heroes, you already were. I just happened to be the one lucky enough to witness it." When the ceremony concluded, people lingered, reluctant to leave this place that held so much meaning. James found himself walking the perimeter of the island, retracing what would have been the survivors' daily paths. The beach where they had collected rainwater, the caves where they had sheltered, the point where they had kept watch for passing ships or planes. Chen joined him near the spot where James had dropped his first package with the note that had given them hope. "You know," Chen said, looking out at the horizon, "we're building something else. A foundation to improve rescue operations in remote areas, better tracking systems for vessels, training programs for pilots to spot signs of people in distress, research into survival techniques." He paused. "We'd like you to be part of it. Your perspective would be valuable." James was quiet for a long moment. 6 months ago, he had been a simple cargo pilot, content with his routine. Now he was being offered a chance to be part of something larger, something that might save others who found themselves in impossible situations. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I'd like that, very much." As they boarded the boats to leave, James took one last look at the islet, at the memorial now standing tall against the sky. He thought about how a single moment of attention, just a glance downward when he might have looked straight ahead, had changed so many lives, including his own. The pilot who spotted movement on a remote isle looked closer and screamed in horror had found something unexpected in the aftermath: purpose. And as the island receded into the distance, James knew with absolute certainty that he would never fly over any patch of land again without looking down. Really, looking.